And we are now live, I think.
All right.
Welcome, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, or if you're doing this in a bout of insomnia, good in the middle of the night to you, to the December 2019 ENSO seminar, which will be given by Juan Loaiza from working in Newcastle at the moment. So the seminar will be looking at some of the anthropological aspects, or I guess you'll be sort of unearthing some of the anthropological commitments of enactivism to some extent. And so we will, just to give people a couple of minutes to link in and start watching. We'll kill time as usual. No particular news this month from the various ENSO community members, but we have, I figure it's probably worth mentioning that the Frontiers special issue, or the research topic, looking at the convergences between inaction and ecological psychology remains open. And if you have a look for that Frontiers research topic, ecological psychology and enactivism, convergences and complementarities, it's going to be a sort of very interesting. We've got a few papers coming in, and they all look like it's going to make a sort of nice collection of points of view, and I'm not sure if we're going to actually manage to build any bridges, but everyone will look across the chasm at least, and that is a worthwhile endeavor. So just before we get started on the actual seminar, Juan, I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell us your story a little bit, because you've got as is surprisingly commonly the case, I think, amongst a lot of enactivists, you've an interestingly diverse and eclectic background. So you started off as an engineer, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Back in Colombia, I did engineering first, and then I moved to the UK. I'm living now in Newcastle, where I moved here in 2011 to do a master in music and musicology, which is kind of a anthropology of music in a sense. And then I moved to Belfast to do a PhD at the Sonic Arts Research Centre. And it was supposed to be a more kind of musically oriented PhD, and I ended up doing a more philosophical oriented PhD, combining ideas of Tim Ingold, who is a big influence in my work, his ideas of humaning, ideas from musicology that belong to the kind of social critique of music, and we talk about musicking rather than music. So musicking is the social practice and everything around doing music. And I became very interested in the embodied and ecological and then the enactivist approaches to cognition. And I ended up kind of building this weird project. So here I am talking about anthropology and activism and all sorts of things. I will also include some musical references.
Excellent. Yes, I think it was in one of your papers you introduced the concept of pleasurable grooviness, which as a technical term, I think should be adopted widely by any and all research communities, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
So
hopefully that will come out next year.
Yeah. That being the case, I think we've sort of a few viewers lined up, and I think it's probably a good point to move into the seminar itself. So I will invite you to give us your talk on Entangled Lives, introducing the Constraint Closure formalism for an anthropologically engaged enactivism.
Okay.
So if you want to.
So I'm going to share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
And you see yourself, is that correct? Yeah.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
And then start here.
Yeah.
So you're looking at my
your slides are go.
My slide. Okay. All right. So thank you so much, Marek, for the invitation. And thanks everyone who is watching this. So I will start with the last part of the title. So the idea is that an anthropologically engaged enactivism is preoccupied with the understanding of the lives of people in their particular socio-cultural situation. That is, an understanding with respect to various aspects of their social practices, roles, narratives, use of technology, and natural resources. And it's also about being engaged with the lives of people together in relation to other groups, including the groups in which the researcher is situated. Now, it is perhaps easy to point to what this is not about. It's not about the reduction of people to the role of self-interested agents within idealized models of social networks. Now, crucially, an anthropologically engaged research needs to understand how people's lives are pulled into more doing, more producing, more consuming ideas, services, products, and stuff. In other words, how lives become more and more entangled with things in a way that drives us into more inequality and environmental destruction. So what does the enactive approach have to do with all this? And by the way, what kind of enactivism I'm talking about? So the first thing is that the enactive approach is desirable because it has already a conceptual toolkit for naturalizing normativity in a non-reductive way. And normativity is, of course, at the heart of social practice. Autonomy is a way of talking about the natural origin of norms in behavior in terms of self-determination. Autonomy, together with the concepts of circularity, co-determination of organism and environment, and emergence, make it possible to establish a continuity of life, mind, and culture. So how is this scaling up that I'm talking about here? So the first thing is that I'm not talking about the scaling up problem of low and high cognition that has been mentioned before. And this is, of course, an important problem. I'm pointing instead to the really big scaling up to society. Now, my intuition is that by approaching this really big scaling up, we might get closer to resolve the problem of low and high cognition. So even if you're not interested in anthropology, putting the problem of really big scaling up in the foreground might pay off for the enactive approach to cognition. Excuse me. So there are two main approaches to scaling up. And these are complementary, of course. One is the phenomenological broad view that includes the lived experiences of people in habits and social practices. And this is, of course, a work in progress in contemporary literature, and myself included. But in this presentation, I will focus on an approach that consists of showing the continuity of the organizational properties of life. So I'm going to make a kind of a declaration of my purpose. So paraphrasing Thompson, culture belongs to life. Life and culture share a core set of formal or organizational properties, and the formal or organizational properties of distinctive of culture are an enriched version of those fundamental to life. Now, before proposing the constraint closure idea, I want to bring attention to the already existing way of scaling up along the life-mind continuity, and I call this the tiered or concentric view of autonomy. On the left side of the screen, you can see the target levels of emergence from basic autopoietic unit down here to culture or society up here. Now we can add on the right a column showing the operational requirements for each of the levels on the left. The idea is that we progress bottom up by adding a new layer of operational requirements, or as I call it here, the operational signature. So we start with autopoiesis, we add activity and agency, then individual history, then individuals together forming super individual autonomies. That gives sense to social cognition. And this is, of course, work done by many people in the field. Now, the last step from social cognition into the wilderness of culture is still pretty much a work in progress. My understanding is that these two operational signatures on the top right of the slide, the heteronomy of cultural norms and the autonomy of the group, have not been derived directly from the organizational properties of the levels below. And this is something we need to work on. instead of bringing into the theory the heteronomy of cultural norms as an external accomplished fact, we need to find a way of deriving it from the organizational properties found at the bottom. So my purpose now is to develop a complementary strategy for scaling up in what we could think of as a much more economical way. And I call this complementary strategy the meshwork view of autonomy. Sorry for the cough. And what I propose is a simplified organizational requirement that connects the minimal instance of autonomy directly to the cultural domain. And I'm going to put it this way. We need to go out there into the wild of culture and social material engagement, find interdependencies across many spatiotemporal scales, and then see if they fit together as a set of interlinked processes and constraints. The point is that such interdependencies need to satisfy what I'm calling here a maximal constraints cycle. And I will show you what I mean by that. So what I present here is not just about constraints, but about constraint cycles, which is a theory put forward by Monteville and Mosio in 2015, and other people like Alvaro Moreno have developed this. And first I need to show some important aspects of constraints, and this is going to be a rather dry part of the talk. So the first aspect is captured in this definition. Constraint refers to a reduction of the degrees of freedom of the elements of a system exerted by some collection of elements, or a limitation or bias on the variability or possibilities of change in the kind of such elements. So this is the typical way people use the concept of constraints across domains of research. What's interesting is the way in which the facts of reducing degrees of freedom is simultaneously the events of a less likely behavior becoming more likely to happen. For example, a catalyst is a constraint on a process by enabling a much faster rate of reaction. Without the catalyst, the reaction would be too slow or simply not happen at all. According to Stuart Kaufman, constraints allow non-spontaneous changes to happen by channeling energy into fewer degrees of freedom. For example, the architecture of a cylinder and piston are designed in such a way that the energy of an expanding hot gas is transferred in only one direction of movement. Expanding hot gases do not expand spontaneously in just one direction. You need constraints for that. Thus, in short, we can say that it takes constraints on the release of energy to create work. And here I'm using work as interchangeably with process. Excuse me. Now we can move on to constraints in life. And to do so, we need a more nuanced view that includes variation and change at different timescales. So the third point is that a constraint and the constraints process each occupy different timescales. As catalysts, enzymes do not significantly transfer energy to or become consumed by the processes they constrain. In other words, from the relative point of view of the constraints process, enzymes remain unchanged, just like the cylinder and piston. However, of course, enzymes are themselves degrading, but in a much slower timescale. In general, constraints in biological systems are never indefinitely stable. They degrade at different timescales relative to the process they constrain, either much slower or much faster. And here is Monteville and Mosio's visual notation for this. On the left here, you see a vertical dash bar from fast down at the bottom to slow, and two T's, T1 and T2, that represent two relatively distinct timescales. You can see them here and here. The process P and its constraint C occupy T1 and 2 respectively. And the vertical arrow pointing downwards represents the constraining action of C on P. Now the fourth point. The stability of constraint C requires the existence of a process that not only creates, but also maintains C at the timescale T2. Here, this process is P1, which is of course different to the constraints process P2. What's interesting is that we have now P1 and P2 linked by a constraining action, but P1 and P2 do not form a chain of transformation of energy or matter. In fact, the two processes may belong to completely different media. And here's the final point, which is that constraints depend on other constraints. The crucial observation is that biological constraints, such as enzymes, are constantly maintained, repaired, and replaced by non-spontaneous processes that require themselves the action of other constraints upstream. So here we see C2 depending on C1. This dependency is already an organizational property. So for Monteville and Mosio, the dependence between constraints brings in principle the possibility of cycles of dependency, whereby a chain of dependent constraints closes onto itself. This is a chain of constraint processes regenerating constraints for other processes that in turn generate the constraints at the beginning of the chain. So one may think of C1 as being dependent on a series of constraints that link back to C2, which is itself dependent on C1. In this graph, C1, C2, and C4 constitute the constraint cycle. C3 and C5 are not in the cycle. So just to recap, and I'm not going to read this, I'm just going to drink some water. Okay, so now I'll briefly talk about constraint closure. For Monteville and Mosio, cycles of constraints in biological systems are necessary for determining the system's operational and organizational closure. A crucial aspect of this particular view of closure is that it does not rely on continuous processes of transformation of energy and matter. It is not a thermodynamic cycle. What matters is that sets of constraints form a constraint cycle that collectively maintains and stabilizes itself. We may call this the realization of self-constraints, or in the words of Alicia Guerrero, the realization of second-order constraints. In this view, the second-order constraint is not simply about reducing degrees of freedom, but about reducing the independence of a multitude of constraints and processes across a wide range of spatio-temporal scales. Following the logic just proposed before, the reduction of independence may also be understood simultaneously as the enablement of further change, a kind of second-order enablement, and perhaps setting the conditions for the emergence of otherwise very unlikely properties realized by new sets of constraints. Now, I will leave this here for further work, and I will try to illustrate the logic of constraint cycles with a fictional example. So now I'm going to talk about drumming. First, because I play drums myself, and second, because it's an example that's easier to scale up quickly with a constraint cycle logic. So the first thing is to imagine a kind of laboratory setting. And here you can distinguish at least two timescales, T1 and T2. A slower one for the hands with drums behavior, and the other faster one for the endogenous dynamics, mostly of the central nervous system. And you may easily identify the constraints of the drum architecture and material properties like elasticity, etc., and the constraints or biases of the drummer's physiology and anatomy. Now, by the way, the horizontal dimension doesn't mean anything. It's not a time dimension. So it's not that drum properties here come before body morphology. The idea of having these horizontal lines is about representing processes, and it helps kind of this entangled process and constraint. Now, the interesting exercise is to describe the link between these two processes, this one in T1 and T2, in terms of mutually dependent constraints. So here we go. On the right-hand side of the cycle here, the hand drum action creates what I call here a multisensory array that constrains the endogenous dynamics. And the endogenous dynamics constantly gives shape to particular motor states, which in turn constrain the hand drum's dynamics. Now, I'm not going to elaborate much more here, but as you can tell, I'm simply redescribing the circularity of a sensory motor loop with a vocabulary that distinguishes between processes and constraints and brings timescales to the foreground. Now, of course, this is only a laboratory setting, but as I said before, we need to go out into the wild and try to find processes that seem interdependent and try to establish their links through constraint dependencies. So we go out into the wild of the world of constraints with the following assumptions. Individuals grow and act embedded in a social material world, a niche that is already highly biased and ordered by previous generations and the particular trajectory of an individual's interactions. Conventions via the arrangements of the social material worlds and the body comportment of others offer a structure in which only a limited number of outcomes can be expected. And some of the constraints present in the social material world are the effect of participatory practices. For example, individuals enact particular roles, like gender roles, within their respective communities of practice. Excuse me. So let's assume that we are talking about a particular tradition of drumming in rural places where fishing constitutes the primary means of subsistence. So the idea is that with a trained eye, we can go from here to something like this. And now we can try to establish the interdependencies that indirectly link, the traditional fishing activities here on the top right, and the actual behavior of drumming. And this cycle takes at least 7 time scales for description. Now, this is just, of course, a fictional example, kind of a caricature, but the proposal is to try to do this with real scenarios. And as you can see, there are already generic activities that may work as templates for more specific descriptions. For example, I'm including here in the center, I'm including orientation of attention and interpersonal coordination as important links halfway through the cycle. We could say that these are almost, let's say, universal activities. Yet, in the practice of going out and looking, my speculation is that we will see a lot more of the kind of particular constraints stemming from the use of more and more things. And this brings us to a different terrain where we can hypothesize what Ian Hodder calls the human thing entanglement. So Hodder is an archaeologist and anthropologist well known for his work in Çatalhöyük, an early Neolithic settlement in southern Turkey. In his words, quote, "The idea of entanglement is that humans get caught in a double bind, depending on things that depend on them. This double bind occurs because material things are unruly and follow biological, chemical, physical processes of transformation and decay." He also talks about path dependence, which for him is the overall long-term increase in the amount of human-made material and associated human thing entanglement, an increase tied up with environmental impact and global inequalities. As I mentioned, Hodder's work is based on excavations in Çatalhöyük. And here's an example. Sorry. And here's an example of how he proceeds to interpret the layers of materials as evidence of growing entanglement. So if you look here in the center, Hodder suggests that more activity in larger houses open the possibility of using domestic spaces for religious ritual practice. And this was possible because in the process of replacing clay balls, which you see here, which is a domestic cooking technology, replacing clay balls with pottery, in that process, people acquired a more flexible use of time. In parallel, the construction of double walls created the possibility of more space in the house and thus more activities like religious rituals. So back to our fictional example, we can speculate of possible trajectories of entanglement. And here we see the slow changing process of traditional fishing. We may imagine something like this. So more people migrating to urban areas for work leads to less people available for learning drums. This leads to stylistic changes in the music, like simple rhythms, which opens the space for the incorporation of new electric instruments. And these instruments bring a new dependency on the electric grid, and so on and so forth. What I'm trying to portray here is the growing entanglement with more and more things. Now, just to finish this section, with the use of the constraint cycle logic, we could speculate how entanglement occurs as constraints are substituted by other constraints that lead to enlarged cycles of constraint dependency. The replacements of clay balls for cooking open up the possibilities for action, further action. Finally, if we think of constraints as tools, we can introduce the logic of complementarity between things, just like when we need both hammers and nails to be able to work faster on a construction project. Now, in the final section, I will propose a way of tackling this possible objection to the view I just presented. And the objection is the constraint really taking care of the continuity of life, mind, and culture? And I propose that this objection could take these, perhaps these three forms. So the first is to say that, well, constraint closure and metabolism and constraint sets above the metabolic level are not really the same thing. And I call this the doesn't scale up argument. And Monteville and Mosio, the authors of the constraint closure, actually suggest something similar to this. The second form of the objection is that constraint closure is not the only thing that autopoietic closure is about. And I call this the something missing at the beginning argument. And the third one, the real continuity needs individual agency first. There is no bypassing of that. And I call this the something missing on the way up argument. Now, in the few minutes that I have in this presentation, I'm only going to sketch a reply to number 1 and 2. And starting with 2, well, I agree there's something missing at the beginning, but this is not a problem for scaling up constraint cycle. And I will show how. And I have to say that I'm going to be very speculative in this final bit. So my strategy is based on recent work by Kaufman. He argues that self-determination and self-production, that is autopoiesis, are the effects of 3 forms of closure: constraint closure, autocatalytic closure, and work closure. And he's been working on the autocatalytic closure for almost 30 years, but only recently he introduced the constraint closure in his theory. The idea is that at the level of minimal autopoiesis, the 3 closures are almost identical. So starting with a simplistic constraint closure in which C1, C2, and C4 form a cycle, we can then think of each of these constraints as a catalyst. So each constraining action is a catalytic process. And here C3 and C4 could be seen as external conditions like pH or temperature. Then we could think of each of these processes as forming a work closure, which may or may not include the circulation of matter or energy between the processes. In this case, it is just simply a change of perspective. So we could be now looking at the actual physical-chemical structure of the system. So my speculation is this. At the level of autopoiesis, that is at the level of the cells, the 3 closures are pretty much locked together. But once we scale up to social material culture, the 3 closures became partially unlocked. To put it in a way, they show a tendency towards closure in different directions. Now, just to be sure, you may still redescribe one cycle in terms of the other. A constrained cycle, no matter how intangible it may seem, is still a form of material entanglement. So, for example, I may describe this communication to you, the talk I'm giving right now, in terms of the processes of my body that allow me to produce sounds. Or I may also redescribe it in terms of the energy consumed by my computer and your computer together with the internet grid. Yet most of us are probably more interested in the description of this communication in terms of the linguistic actions taking place. That is, in terms of the constraining effect that my stream of utterances has on your endogenous dynamics here and now, and how these constraints are dependent on constraints, other constraints, residing at larger timescales of my and your participation in homologous communities of linguistic use. The constraint cycle that describes this current communication doesn't have to follow the same shape of the work process or autocatalytic cycles that also conform the current situation. Now, of course, the question now is how this unlocking took place in human history. A question that brings us back to Horder's interpretation of Neolithic layers of materials as evidence of an expanding entanglement. Or perhaps even further back, for example, to the earliest instances of control of fire, by which our ancestors created completely novel cycles of processes. I don't, of course, have an answer to this question. So, to conclude, excuse me, the constraint closure does 2 things. Provides a strategy for scaling up from the organization of minimal autopoiesis to the organizational properties of human entanglement. Constraint closure is not the only thing that can be said about autopoiesis, but as I just showed, we may gain depth of field by distinguishing between three forms of closure at the level of social material culture. And second, the constraint closure shows how entangled processes at multiple timescales manifest self-constrained circularity. This circularity gives life to the immanent normativity of social material culture. And finally, the paradox of entanglement is that it grows as constraint cycles expand into new possibilities. To put it in a way, the more creative we are as a species, the more entangled we become. Constraint cycles provide the ground for an anthropologically engaged and active approach, but this needs to be complemented, of course, with an expanded phenomenological view of social life. We not only need to pay attention to the interdependencies that play in human culture, but also understand the path dependence that drives us to environmental destruction and deeper global inequalities. And perhaps, with a bit of luck, we could understand how to disentangle. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Juan. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, excuse me for, I have a terrible cough right now, so
That's happens to us all at various times. So there is a lot to unpack there and many layers. And
just hold on a second. How do I get out from here?
You have
stop sharing. Yeah.
One. Bingo. So yes, thank you very much for that. So I have kind of a couple of questions, and then I guess there's sort of a few things that I might actually just unpack a little bit further. And I also note that you dropped in a couple of things that you deliberately didn't say anything about, just so I could ask questions if needs to be. So thank you for that. But let's start off with we sort of back up a little bit, just to get at some of the issues about layering. And how to think about that notion of layering. So on one of your early slides, you included just a sort of fairly traditional model of what the scaling up thing looks like, or what the scale looks like from individual autonomous identity sort of small units to culture, passing through sensory motor, intersubjective, and so on the way up. Now, those notions of tiers are sort of useful, and they're often very intuitive, but they do, later on, you used a different vocabulary, which I suspect is the one that you're more interested in, which is that notion of concentricity rather than layering. So that you know, again, it's just a sort of characteristic of the mode of presentation, but that layer looks very linear and stacked, such that each level is describable independently of the one beneath it. To what extent are you committed to that, or purely an artifact of the fact that you're using PowerPoint, I guess, and boxes? But given that, you know, an enactive approach would tend to suggest not a stacking of layers, but a transformation of layers. So PowerPoint does allow you to put things on top of the other and then have transparency going through, which I did at the end with these kind of circular things after I talk about Kaufman. It might be just that I'm just simplifying the story of how to go from the minimal unit, this kind of abstract idea of the autopoietic unit, all the way up. There's a simplification there. I do think that the layers are these are emergent levels that reorganize what's happening in the previous in the other stage. And then, of course, you need to, in any kind of systems view, you need to consider the different ranges simultaneously. So you cannot just focus on one layer, sort of speaking. But that was perhaps an artifact of the presentation, in which I wanted to present that, and then say that we could have perhaps a more economical strategy, not in terms of a competing strategy, but a complementary strategy that kind of builds up quickly
from the constraint cycles and constraint closure at the level of the minimal unit, and then you can just scale up very quickly to the social domain. So yeah, it might be a case that I'm just simplifying for the sake of presenting some kind of a contrast. But I think I also presented kind of little, also in the PowerPoint you can put some arrows and all that. So I also presented the idea that I could re-describe many of these stages in terms of constraint closure. Yeah, I don't know if that's an answer.
I think a perfect follow-up. Ezekiel via YouTube has noted, so I'm going to read here. But Ezekiel says thanks for the talk, but he wonders if the framework is actually consistent with your goals. So I'll hopefully be able to articulate this well enough. If constraints are slower timescale processes that are acting or restricting or enabling faster timescale processes, how can there be any constraint closure? In order to act as a constraint, C1 must be slower than P1. So there can't be any constraining arrows going up in the diagram.
Oh, yeah.
Because no faster process can constrain a slower one.
Oh, yeah. I did mention, well, probably because the examples I gave were kind of very intuitive examples of constraints, like the cylinder and the piston, which are things that degrade very slowly, or the enzyme that degrades slower than the process that is constrained by the enzyme. But of course, you find other ways of talking about constraints. And I did mention that constraints can degrade faster. So they need to be, so the idea is that, and this is actually Monteville and Mosio's idea, I'm just communicating this here. The idea is that you have processes that continuously replace the constraint. So you have a constraint, a protein, for example, that would be degrading very fast. You have to keep that constraint, you have to maintain the replacement of that constraint. So the constraint in that sense, the fast constraint, is kind of a statistical property of the process rather than being just a static structure that is there. So it might be a case that the examples I'm giving are usually on the slow constraint side. But yeah, already from the beginning, in what Monteville and Mosio are proposing, they tackle that idea of the only way you can close that multi-timescale circuit is by having this kind of arrows going up from very fast to very slow.
Is it like basically the constraints of the slower timescale enable mass action at the faster timescale? So if the faster timescales were not constrained, they'd never form masses or aggregates or whatever it is. I guess almost like a cell bound or like a cell wall as well. That the constraints enables the things within the constraints to behave in a different way. And that new way allows for the potential for constraints of slower processes. Is it something like that? Yep. Okay.
Yeah, the thing is that is because it's more intuitive to think of constraints as slow things. Part of part of the problem to present these ideas is to emphasize the idea that they are fast constraints. I didn't talk about language, for example. I only mentioned at the end, but I kind of follow the ideas by Joanna Ręczak and Howard Patti, which is that you have linguistic actions which constrain the dynamics of interactions. And you can see that depending on whether you put the linguistic actions and the dynamics of interaction up or down in timescales, then you have to account for the stream of utterances as either fast constraints or slow constraints. And I think the idea that utterances are kind of replicable constraints fits with the idea of fast constraint, fast changing and replaced constraints, which are, of course, connected to, and this is an extension of the presentation, but they are connected to other slower constraints, which is, for example, having a repertoire of utterances.
Okay. So given that, that certainly seems to make sense to me. So I guess given that you're kind of dependent on the Monteville-Mosio perspective so heavily, then I guess we should take their doubts seriously too, right? So if you mentioned that they aren't convinced that it scales up, and can you sort of articulate their doubts maybe and say how you? I know that was sort of a good chunk of the latter section of the talk, but is there? I kind of missed their very specific criticism.
Yeah.
Why is it they think that your account won't work?
Yeah, so they in their paper they have this paragraph talking about whether we could think of, for example, the relationship between hunting and cooking in a group as kind of two levels and two activities that are constraining one another, and then you have some kind of a constraint cycle. And they say that they basically go for the idea that it needs to be stronger, that it shouldn't be kind of a loose sense of constraints. I think the feeling that it is loose at that level is because you actually not only need the constrained story, you also need stories of energy circulation. You need stories of how we historically how we discovered and controlled fire, and then we were able to externalize digestion in cooking, and we were able to do all these other work energy process cycles. So that's why my argument is about saying, okay, if you think that the constraint cycle is too loose at the social material level, is because we actually need to consider these other cycles, these other closures of energy transformation, of the actual physical chemical part of living together, and you have to put the three things together. Otherwise, it does sound like you're just making an analogy in a loose way. Okay. So that's the point they do. But there's also work on ecosystemic constraint closure, which I just discovered recently by a group of people in Brazil. Nunes Neto, I think, is the researcher doing this.
Okay, so essentially, that's kind of a very enactive move to make, I guess, and but it's often a valid and successful one where I guess if it looks like it's not working, try a historical or developmental perspective, and you see things that aren't apparent in a more cross-sectional view. Okay. Cool. I guess that this is a sort of slightly less specific, but I guess related notion, just in terms of unpacking the concepts in play here. Then now I know again this was sort of something you threw out a promissory note on, but it has to do with this distinction between reduction of degrees of freedom and, as you put it, reductions of independence. So I just wanted to get you to elaborate on that concept a little bit more. Sort of how are you parsing Paredo's notion of second order constraint here?
Oh yeah, well, no, that was kind of a tangential thing that I wanted to mention to have a conversation. I don't exactly know how to put back Paredo's work back in here. She's definitely an influence in the original work on constraints. The idea, what she talks about, how you may have these arrangements of constraints put together and they lose their independence. We need to talk about the process of not in terms of the positive gain of interdependence, but in terms of the kind of negative logic of reducing the independence. So you have constraints that tend to split apart. What the cycle does is to describe a history of reducing this independence. So I'm just trying to put back this kind of proscriptive logic of, we are not talking about necessarily interdependence. We are more precisely talking about the reduction of independence. So that's where it's going, but I'm not entirely sure. Right. This is just the way to put it.
Well, I guess there were interesting resonances for me in terms of Hannah and Ezekiel's participatory sense making, where essentially a reduction of autonomy in the case of the individuals involved in an interaction can nevertheless increase the overall autonomy in the system. because you have it sort of allows for essentially the creation of an emergent level of description.
Yeah.
So it sort of seems to be a kind of operating in a similar or somewhat similar vein.
All right.
But I might be either misrepresenting participatory sense making there or misunderstanding Poirot or both. So that would be.
Yeah. No, but that's a good point, and I haven't thought of that. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So sorry. I'll take the bait on your last promissory note as well then, which had to do with the third critique that you said you weren't going to say anything about, but you don't put it on a slide if you don't want to say anything about it. So, something's missing on the way up. What's missing, and why shouldn't we care?
Okay, that was just to remind myself that what I'm presenting is a complementary view to the other one, in which you have to first develop a theory of the agency of the system in order to go up, in order to scale up. So this is just to remind myself and you that I'm not making a kind of a competition between two alternatives. But I also have a stronger view, which is that, and this is probably a more anthropological sense of agency. My view is that you find agency. It's not something that you create by hypothesis. You need to go out into the wild and find that agency, how it actually is produced in these entanglements of the lives of people, and that's a view that is shared by, for example, people like Entangled. He wouldn't either just put agency in the system from the beginning. He wouldn't say that agency just spread everywhere. We would just have to go out and find that agency. We have to reconstruct, as observers, we have to reconstruct the agency. And I think in that strong sense, this way of thinking of constrained cycles is a way of mapping the interconnections. But yeah, I don't have a definite answer to that. But yeah, I present this kind of the weaker, more ecumenical sense and the stronger sense of the idea of how to find agency.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you bring up Engle. One of his aphorisms that I love and I would just sort of print out and stick on my wall is life is not in things, things are in life. And so while there is, as you say, he sort of very much has that notion of finding agency, or agency does not depend on is not just a perspective of the observer, nor is it easily circumscribed. That to draw a boundary around the thing that is agent is problematic. So I guess, is that going to cause a problem, or is that a benefit for you when it comes to this issue of, or to the question of scaling up?
Well, I have the two options, and I can try to run the two options. Whether I think that agency is something that you have to find in the wild, in specific ethnographic work, or something that you need to include in by hypothesis in the theory. I do think that by hypothesis we need to assume that there is asymmetry. And that's an important aspect of the idea of agency and enactivism. That is an asymmetrical relationship between some kind of between a pole, kind of what I think as a density of constraints on one side, and something else that is not that dense, which would be the environment. But yeah, I mean, the constraints view and this kind of meshwork view could work without a predefined idea of agency.
Okay. making it more of an empirical issue.
Yeah, it might be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I think this is probably a good place to finish. But I will remind yourself, Juan, and also to anyone watching that the discussion can continue on the ENSO Seminars webpage, ensoseminars.com. At the page there for Juan's talk, there is a discuss forum where you can sign in and follow the discussions there. I'm trying to sort of keep track of a couple of different screens here, and I just note that Ezekiel replied to your reply. Just very briefly, I guess it's just a question of, would you not just call everything a process? Given that kind of, if processes can constrain other processes, is there a I guess the question is, do we want to have a category of constraint as a thing that happens, or is it just constraining as just what one process will do whenever it affects another process?
Yeah. That's a good one, because what you find first is the activities. Now the thing is that what you can actually capture in the observation, I think, is the constraints. Those are the things that you could specify and in the methodology. It depends, of course. If we are just simply talking about the use of dynamical systems theory, then you would just simply talk about processes, and you could think of each of these activities, or each of these lines that I was drawing in different timescales, as non-equilibrium processes that you can study with the tools of dynamical systems theory. But I think we for an anthropologically engaged kind of an active approach, we need a bit more than that. Of course, as I said, we need the phenomenological work, which is very important. And I didn't mention anything about that. But we also need some way of observing that is perhaps easier for myself and many other people, and that would be something like observing constraints. And you can still have the modeling of the processes here, but you can also capture the constraining events and actions.
Excellent. Okay, so I will. It just remains for me to say thank you very much, Juan, and we will look. Thank you. I'm going to be pondering that one because it links to a whole bunch of stuff from my own interests as well. I absolutely agree on the need for more anthropological engagement. But it is a matter of finding the right hooks. There's some sort of very useful stepping stones there, I think, that you've built.
Right.
So it makes me more optimistic. I sort of said at the start that I wondered whether there'd be anything other than staring across the chasm in this conspiracy topic, and now I'm more optimistic that things might get built.
All right.
We'll see how naive I am in a few minutes. Once this topic is out. So thanks very much, and we will be back in February. I think we're going to take a nice hibernating winter, and there'll be an ENSO seminar with Alex Penn from the University of Surrey. Sorry, I think it's Surrey, or maybe it's Sheffield. I'll have to check. From in February. So look forward to seeing people then.
Okay, thank you so much.
Cheers.
Bye.